What wedding moment made you think they are not going to last long? Story 1. It wasn't the couple getting married, but the best man and maid of honor who were married to each other. The best man's speech was all about how hard it was to be married. I've been married for a year, and it feels like 100 years. The maid of honor stood up to give her speech and just said, "Ditto." It was incredibly awkward and really brought the whole room down. The bride's brother then stood up and gave a nice impromptu speech about teamwork and having a partner to go through life with. He talked about how happy the family was to welcome the groom. Within a year, the best man and maid of honor were divorced, while the newlyweds are still married 30-plus years later. Sometimes I wonder if those speeches actually showed them what not to do as a couple. There's a complex backstory for me. The bride's brother is gay and has been in a long-term relationship for over 40 years. At the time he gave his speech about marriage, he couldn't legally marry the person he loved, and I believe his passionate defense of marriage came from that place. When people used to say they were against same-gender marriage because it mocked marriage, I thought of that night. The married couple, who seemed to have no respect for marriage, could easily get married, and did over and over, while the man who stood up to defend marriage couldn't. Now he's married and lovingly takes care of his husband, who is dealing with health issues. Story 2. 2 days before the wedding, she told me that she found her fiancé annoying, didn't like him, and that he was terrible in bed. She was visibly constantly uncomfortable during the rehearsal wedding and dinner. Then she cried the entire morning on the wedding day. She didn't get any makeup done because she wouldn't stop sobbing and refused to get dressed, delaying the wedding by about 35 minutes. When the ceremony started, she recited 45 minutes of vows she had prepared, 9 pages of remarks about her friends, family, his parents and sisters, all unrelated to her husband. Then she almost didn't say "I do." She managed to say, yeah, okay, yeah, I do, about 60 seconds after she was supposed to. I could talk about this for hours, but it was the most painful, awkward wedding I've ever attended. I'm betting they'll last 10 months. We're 1 month in. Story 3. One of my good friends got married, and I hadn't met his bride before the wedding because she's just shy. On the wedding day, she was very drunk before the ceremony even started and couldn't get through the lines she was supposed to repeat, like, "I promise to love you." She ended up slapping the groom, spilling champagne on her dress and then crying under a table while he tried to comfort her. They lasted about 4 months. Another was my wife's friend. She's a very conservative religious woman who married a black man. Most of her family, who didn't approve, didn't attend, but she planned the entire wedding around race. She had a vanilla cake for her and a chocolate cake for him, black and white wedding colors, and even the meals were white meat for her side and dark meat for his. It was extremely uncomfortable as a guest. They lasted 2 years, but broke up because he was abusive, not because of the racial issues. Story 4. 3 days before the wedding, the maid of honor had promised to purchase a stylized dress for the bride, which they had agreed on, but she called to tell us she had no money and was embarrassed to admit it. So we literally hand-sewed a dress together in 24 hours. I think it turned out pretty well for what we had. The bride's mother was supposed to pick up the cake in Austin and drive an hour south to the wedding. She left her house 30 minutes before the wedding to get it. When she finally arrived, an hour late, the cake was destroyed. She had put it in the back seat and drove all the way down, letting it slide around with every turn. During the 1-hour delay, there was almost a fist fight between 2 groomsmen because, well, the maid of honor showed up in the dress she couldn't afford. It was an obvious attempt to upstage the bride. During her speech after the ceremony, she started by saying, "When we all met, I didn't like Drakarim 411 at all, but I found that he grows on you, like a fungus." Needless to say, my entire side of the family was not pleased. Since all of these issues involved her friends and family, I was told to just tolerate it, and we'd discuss it later. I assumed many of these friends would naturally distance themselves. Quite the opposite. 2 years later, I accepted a well-paying job out of college, which was an hour and a half away from Austin, and she decided to stay in Austin to be near her friends. I mailed her the divorce papers, and since she didn't bother to show up at the hearing, I've never seen her again. Story 5. This wasn't at the wedding itself, but I used to work at a David's bridal. A bride came in with tons of friends, and we did the whole say yes to the dress thing. After about an hour, she's standing there in $3,000 worth of items, but she doesn't have any money on her or in her account. She decides to apply for the store credit card. I run it through the system, and she gets denied. She then calls the groom for his information, which, to be fair, happened often, but he tells her no. She throws a huge fit on the phone with him, standing on the bridal stage, literally demanding, "Why not? Why? Why?" Like an actual child, over and over again. I've never seen a 30-year-old act so childishly so quickly. She was literally stomping her feet in front of me, her friends, and another bride in the store. I was embarrassed for her. After all of that, she hangs up and her friend says, "I'm so sorry you can't get your dress." The bride stops crying instantly and just says, "Oh, I'll get the dress. I just have to wait until he's mad enough, and then he'll come get it for me, so I'll stop." Speechless. Sure enough, she came back 2 days later with him, and he applied for the credit card and bought the dress. He was livid and silent, while she was smug as could be. I can't imagine they're having a happy marriage, if they're even still together. Story 6. My wife was invited to a client's daughter's wedding. Both the bride and groom were drama students, and many in the bridal party were also drama students. The maid of honor's toast consisted of tearful declarations of unrequited love for the groom, along the lines of, "If it couldn't be me, I'm glad it's my best friend marrying you." The best man's speech was a flirtatious invitation. "If it doesn't work out, call me, babe, like the last time you called me." Other toasts were just as strange. A guy at our table, a friend of the bride, whispered to me that he was this close to standing up during the "speak now or forever hold your peace" part. I'm still unsure if the whole event was a group of emotionally conflicted 20-somethings or one big piece of performance art. Story 7. At my boyfriend's sister's wedding, the groom got drunk before the vows and smoked afterward. He was completely cross-faded and ended up embarrassing himself. When we went up to congratulate them afterward, the bride refused to stand near him or take pictures with him. It was awkward. After the speeches, nearly everyone left. Some families stayed, and they began opening gifts. Someone had gifted them nice champagne, and the groom tried to open it, only to drop and shatter the bottle. The bride stormed off screaming. The groom got frustrated and started shouting at no one in particular. They still went on their honeymoon to Florida, and she got pregnant shortly afterward. About 7 months into her pregnancy, she kicked him out because he had been with her roommate. They got divorced when their child was 6 months old. Honestly, it was for the best. He was irresponsible and wasted a lot of their money by making their wedding all about himself. Story 8. I attended the wedding of a friend of my husband's, someone I knew casually. When we arrived at the church, the groom was very drunk in the parking lot, and still drinking. I thought it was wild, especially since it was a full Catholic ceremony with lots of kneeling and standing. I have no idea how he made it through, but somehow he did. At the reception, he continued the drinking, while his new wife cried in the restroom. When it was time for their first dance, he stumbled around the dance floor, despite a year of dance lessons. Later, when it was time for him to remove his new wife's garter and toss it, he instead did a striptease down to his underwear in front of elderly family members. People were shocked and murmuring, and overall, it was a complete disaster. I gave the marriage a year or two tops. However, they are still married 25+ years later. Story 9. I was graciously invited as a last-minute +1 to the wedding of a family friend I hadn't met before. At the rehearsal dinner, or the German equivalent, the Poltera Bend, the guests smashed ceramic and porcelain items on the ground. I was new to Germany, so this was pretty out of context and a bit frightening, but my boyfriend explained that it's a tradition meant to remind the couple that life can be challenging and they have to work together to clean it up. The bride half-heartedly motioned to the groom to start sweeping. He did a little, then moved on to chat with his friends, leaving most of the shards scattered across the yard. I don't think I saw the couple speak to each other once over the next 3 days of celebrations. It was a beautiful wedding, and I'm so grateful I was invited. A really nice start to my time in a new country. But it wasn't a huge shock to hear they divorced a few years later. Story 10. The ceremony was delayed because the bride and groom were on the phone with the groom's mother, who had refused to attend, trying to convince her to still go through with it. Apparently, they'd had a huge physical argument the night before. Their roommate at the time also didn't attend. He told me what he'd seen in the house the previous night was enough to know this wedding was doomed, and they shouldn't even be dating, let alone getting married. To answer some questions, this was about 20 years ago, and we're all in our 40s now, so I'm not sure why the mother wasn't there. I remember thinking it was strange that she wasn't, and then later overheard that they were on the phone with her. The roommate was visibly angry when I went to pick him up for the wedding. He outright refused to come and ended up moving out and disappearing shortly after. He was a big guy who worked as a bouncer, and I got the impression he'd had to go into work mode in his own living room the night before, and he was not happy about it. I never heard the details and didn't feel right asking. I'm still friendly with both the bride and groom and see them every few years. They're in a much better place now, considering everything. I should add that during the years they dated and got married, all of us were heavy drinkers. We were in our 20s and worked in the service industry, so all this drama seemed almost normal. Looking back, I feel differently. None of us ended up in rehab or prison, and we all live relatively stable lives now. Story 11. This story involves my sister's best friend and happened during a bachelorette party. The bride had been having an affair, and everyone knew about it. The groom's friends tried to tell him, but she convinced him they were making it up. At that point, it was just sad. She even made the groom apologize to the guy she was seeing for the accusations. On the night of the bachelorette party, she took all her bridesmaids back to the other guy's house and spent the night there. The affair guy even attended the wedding. It was so awkward. Everyone knew, and everyone was talking. The groom was told, but chose to overlook it. After the wedding, she insisted the affair guy go on vacations with her and her husband and invited him to all their social gatherings. Now, if they had a non-monogamous arrangement, that would be one thing. But her husband was deeply affected by it, and she just kept manipulating him. No one could convince him to leave. She told my sister that the affair guy didn't want marriage or kids, so she was using her fiancé to get both. They ended up divorcing 2 years later after their second child was born. She immediately moved in with the affair guy, and they eventually got married. To add more context, everyone in this story was really young, except the affair guy, who was a bit older, had already been married and divorced, and had a few kids of his own. The original couple had been together since middle school, and all of this happened when they were between 21 and 23. The husband was naive and very invested in their relationship. A typical small-town, marry your high school sweetheart situation. The affair guy didn't go on their honeymoon, but he was included in group trips before and after the wedding. Others in the friend group eventually refused to go if he was invited. The bride had this twisted power move where her husband wasn't allowed to disrespect the affair guy, and any jealousy or suspicion was just his own insecurity. She insisted that anyone who thought they were more than friends simply didn't understand platonic friendship. The bride and affair guy are still married, and the second child is likely his. The groom eventually married another girl from their high school and seems content. Story 12. She had a panic attack while getting ready, worrying that he wouldn't show up and implying that he didn't actually want to get married again, but felt it was too late to back out. They were both barely 21, and it was his second marriage. Did I mention they got engaged just 6 weeks after they met? And they only waited that long because his divorce hadn't been finalized. She was relieved when he did show up, having had a few shots to build up his courage. He was fairly tipsy by 11 a.m. They separated a year later, but she ended up pregnant around the same time. They got back together for the baby and then divorced when the child was 2. Within a month of separating, she and their child were living with a new guy she'd known for 3 weeks. Story 13. This was a friend's wedding back in 2016, a relatively nice event considering we were all in our early 20s. I was a bridesmaid and hadn't really met the groom much before. He was polite but quiet. The day before the wedding, the bride, a longtime friend, asked me to help babysit one of the groomsmen because he was trouble. She asked me, another bridesmaid, and even the DJ to help keep him away from alcohol before the ceremony, prevent him from making any speeches, keep him from hitting on women, the works. This guy was a troublesome character with 6 kids and 2 DUIs, but he was the groom's best friend. On the wedding day, he broke into the bar, got drunk, had to be dragged down the aisle, got the florist drunk, and they pretty much had an inappropriate dance floor moment, then gave an incoherent speech during the father-daughter dance. The bride was stressed, trying to stop everything from turning into a disaster. The groom, however, blocked us from reining his friend in and wanted us to let it go, despite the bride's wishes. It almost seemed like intentional self-sabotage. The groomsman even broke into the groom's private stash of homemade mead, made especially for the wedding, stripped his clothes, and ran through the parking lot hiding in bushes at 11 p.m. Later that night, the couple texted me asking if I'd be interested in joining them as a third in their open relationship, which, as I found out later, was mostly the groom's idea. I also learned they married quickly because she suddenly needed medical benefits. He'd been asking for an open relationship since the beginning, but she only agreed if he'd marry her. They divorced a year and a half later. Story 14. Here's the basic background. This couple had gotten married on some tropical island, and since most of their friends and family couldn't attend, they decided to throw a lavish party when they got back. This led them to spend almost absurd amounts of money on what might have been the tackiest celebration I've ever seen. Imagine renting an elementary school cafeteria and hiring someone with questionable taste to decorate it. They commissioned an expensive caterer, but requested only food that you might find at a county fair, citing that nobody likes fancy stuff. Finally, they hired a DJ whose idea of a first dance song was Freaks of the Industry by Digital Underground. I'm exaggerating a bit, but yes, that was the song they chose. Everyone has different tastes, so I figured they were getting what they wanted. But shortly before the money dance, which was the first time I'd even heard of this tradition, I overheard a piece of gossip. Apparently, they'd already argued about how much was spent on the reception. The bride thought it was a disaster, while the groom insisted it was classy. He was so confident, in fact, that he used his new wife's credit card to pay for it. She was understandably upset when she found out and had temporarily kicked him out, prompting him to stay with an old girlfriend. There were rumors that something happened during his stay, but the bride eventually forgave him. The gossip continued. Supposedly, this money dance was meant to help them recoup their financial losses, with the implication that their marriage's future depended on them raising upwards of $30,000 in a few minutes. As I watched and added up the bills being pinned to each of them, I couldn't help but think, yeah, this isn't going to last. Story 15. It wasn't at a wedding, but it was the first time I had a real conversation with this couple. They came to town about a year after their wedding, and my wife, who is the groom's cousin, and I met them for drinks in a popular part of the city. One of the first topics they brought up was our knowledge of the lifestyle scene, in this case meaning the swinger lifestyle. Afterward, I mentioned to my wife that the bride seemed to have been openly flirting with her. My wife shrugged it off, as I'm not always the best at picking up on those signals. We met them again at a funeral. After the ceremony, we were in a hotel room having a few drinks. Once more, the bride seemed to flirt with my wife and even went out of her way to demonstrate her skills with certain decorative knots. The groom was in the room, watching all this. I pointed it out again, and this time, my wife acknowledged it. They divorced soon after, and it turned out that the bride had only discovered, or accepted, that she was a lesbian after marrying. Story 16. This is more of a bachelor party story than a wedding story. My ex got married 2 years ago to a woman from a very conservative religious family. We were still friends, and I was surprised he asked me to be a groomsman. But I figured it was a sign of maturity, staying on good terms with exes and all that. He got really drunk at the bachelor party, and at one point, he asked if I had any regrets about our breakup. I told him I had loved him, but no, we'd made the right choice in the long run. Then he said he sometimes wished we were the ones getting married the following week and mentioned how his fiance's family would never truly accept him. After a pause, he jokingly suggested, "What if we just ran away together?" I laughed it off and suggested we rejoin the group. But he brought it up again later, still joking, and then a third time. We'd been friends for years but only dated for about 6 months. It turns out he'd asked the same thing to another ex who wasn't a groomsman, but was attending the wedding. Story 17. My ex-wife had a flair for drama and wanted a choreographed dance number for our first dance, involving the whole wedding party, but no one else was interested. I'd never danced before, not even casually, but I was willing to take lessons so she could have her dream wedding. I wasn't good, but I got through a few lessons of slow dancing and learned to shuffle around, though nothing fancy. The dance school wouldn't choreograph anything for us, so she gave up on that idea. When it came to choosing a song, she picked I Want You To by Weezer, my favorite band, and the song had just come out. But it's not a slow song, so I suggested we pick something else. She insisted we'd just slow dance to it and promised she wouldn't change her mind. Of course, 30 seconds into the song, she stepped back and started dancing a jig. I just stood there, fuming, while she shouted for me to join her in front of all our guests. On top of that, we had set a budget, which she exceeded. Then her parents offered to contribute $5,000, but rather than use it to cover the excess, she decided to spend even more. Looking back, it was a huge sign of her lack of respect for me. She later cheated on me and ran off with another guy within a year, remarrying before our divorce was even finalized. Her parents never actually gave the $5,000 because they had put a condition on it, that we go on a weekend retreat up north for a financial planning course run by a friend of theirs. My ex, who was also an atheist, Didn't want to do that, but knowingly spent the money we didn't actually have. Story 18. When I was in college, I went to a wedding with my girlfriend during the summer. We'd only been dating a few months, so this was my first time meeting the bride, groom, and most of her family. I didn't say much to my girlfriend at the time since I didn't know them aside from what she'd told me, but I had a feeling they wouldn't last. At the reception, the bride spent most of her time talking to her friends, barely interacting with anyone else. The groom, meanwhile, went around trying to spend time with everyone, but whenever he was with her, she barely acknowledged him. As I walked by her to get a drink, I overheard her bragging about how much she'd spent on her dress, saying he had wanted her to get a cheaper one, but she refused. Later, I was outside smoking with other guests, and he came out asking to bum a cigarette. He was one of those people who only smokes when drunk, which wasn't often since he was busy with his hospital residency. Every time the door opened, he quickly hid the cigarette behind his back, worried it might be her. It wasn't a playful kind of fear. It seemed like he was genuinely scared of her. So it wasn't a huge surprise when I heard they divorced a year later. She had apparently been taking advantage of him, staying home all day, and spending thousands on clothes and shoes using his money and credit cards she'd opened in their names. Story 19. That's exactly how I felt at my own wedding. I had no control over it. It was all his family's planning. The reception was at the local fairgrounds with fried chicken and corn on the cob for the meal. My husband was adamant there would be no music and absolutely no dancing, as he refused to dance. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law ordered 6 cases of cheap champagne and were upset when no one wanted to drink it, including me. They couldn't even give it away. The after-party was at my mother-in-law's house. The reception lasted about 2 hours just for lunch, where my husband, as a wedding gift, promised he was officially done smoking. He had his whole family form a circle around him so he could try to smoke an entire pack quickly, out of my sight. I had a friend pick me up and I left. There were plenty more WTF moments before and after, but we lasted only 2 months. Story 20. I didn't attend this wedding, but the whole relationship seemed suspicious. A friend of mine had a close friend who, after college, moved back to her small, conservative hometown. She suddenly changed her mind about her dreams of going overseas for a PhD and becoming an archivist. Instead, she started posting about a new guy she just met and was dating. 3 weeks later, she posted about ring shopping. Around this time, she started bailing on commitments to her friends, becoming less available in group chats, always with an excuse for why she couldn't hang out. She even bailed last minute on her friend's bachelorette party, which she had planned. 3 months after meeting, she posted that she and her new boyfriend were engaged. None of her friends had met him. Red flags, alarm bells, and sirens were going off for us, but she couldn't see them. Another 3 months later, she announced they'd snuck off and gotten married just 6 months after meeting. Still, none of her friends had met him, and she wasn't available for her friends anymore. Instead of pursuing her PhD, she was hopping between part-time jobs at coffee shops and banks. From her friend's perspective, it looked like she'd met some small-town guy who was isolating her from her support system while rushing her into marriage. She'd never been in a serious relationship and had grown up sheltered, so it was worrisome. She seemed naive and easily influenced. If a new partner wanted to go ring shopping after 3 weeks, I'd run. But this girl thought she was living in a Jane Austen novel. I'm betting either the marriage fizzles when the novelty wears off, or she realizes years later, after having kids and settling down, that she made a mistake. She has no means of supporting herself independently, so it's concerning. Story 21. This was the wedding of my own parents. They'd been divorced for many years, but told us, their kids and our spouses, they planned to remarry and asked if we'd like to go with them to Las Vegas to witness it. We were all in our 20s and thought, why not? 2 days into the trip and there was still no word of a wedding. The kids had a conversation. Should we ask about it? In hindsight, that should have been our first clue that this wasn't a good idea. But we lacked perspective, so we pressured them. Hey, you told us you were going to get remarried. When are you doing it? Soon we found ourselves in a courtroom, speaking to a judge. He was wise and asked to speak to my parents privately, probably asking, why are you doing this? Are you sure? They must have given him the right answers because, in the end, he performed the ceremony. Story 22. The first wedding was a hastily thrown-together, Santa-themed ceremony for my wife's cousin. He'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant, so they rushed to get married before the baby arrived. The wedding was held at a VFW, with the groom and bride dressed as Santa and Mrs. Claus. The groomsmen and bridesmaids were all dressed as Christmas elves, and the music was provided by a boombox. It was 1997. It was clear no one was happy about the wedding. The couple's parents just glared at each other and didn't speak. The only person who seemed excited was the groom. They had the baby a few months later and divorced almost immediately after. Another wedding involved a 19-year-old friend of my daughter. My daughter was the maid of honor and didn't like the groom. He came from a very conservative Christian family, but had hidden many of his extreme beliefs. The wedding started typically, but it soon veered into very uncomfortable territory. The vows talked about the wife submitting to and obeying her husband, being his helpmate, and providing him with children. It felt straight out of a dystopian novel, shocking most of the guests. Several people audibly gasped when the minister essentially said the husband's only responsibility was to consider his wife. Thankfully, they divorced within a year and split up before having kids. Story 23. My best friend always dreamed of her wedding day, having children, and so on. We'd been friends since we were 2, so I knew this well. We talked about it often and vowed to be each other's maid of honor. Then a boy came into her life and she fell head over heels for him, but he never really seemed to be the romantic type. Long story short, they got engaged and suddenly she didn't want a big wedding. She wanted a small elopement with no bridesmaids. When the topic of children came up, she didn't want them anymore either. I know plans can change as we grow older, but this just didn't seem like her. Still, I supported her. They did end up having a big reception. My guess is that this was their compromise. At the reception, I remember the groom barely being around at all. He was just drinking and hanging out with his friends, barely spending time with his wife. I had a gut feeling then that it wasn't going to last. 5 years into the marriage, he cheated on her and broke her heart. It took her a while to recover, but today, she's much better off with a man who treats her right. She's now happily talking about the wedding she always dreamed of and having children. Story 24. The husband in this story was the son of a mega pastor for a large church chain. He wasn't a bad guy and actually had different views from his family, but he understood that his family's reputation hinged on his wedding. His parents paid for it, so it became a massive church event. It was traditional and pretty, but put a huge amount of pressure on the couple. The bride was agnostic with some pagan leanings. She was nice, and I was friends with her, but she didn't handle pressure from his family well. They clearly did not like her and made that known. During the ceremony, she had to repeat phrases like, "I will obey and honor my husband," and the vows focused heavily on how subservient and obedient the wife should be. My husband and I exchanged looks because that was so unlike her and not reflective of their relationship at all. We hoped our gut feelings were wrong. The couple ended up moving so the husband could go to med school, and they lived with his family for about a year in a state where she had no friends, family, or job. His family treated her poorly, and he was so busy with school that she was often left alone with them. It was a tough situation for her. She eventually became openly hostile toward them and her husband, especially when he refused to move back to her hometown. They divorced after about 4 years. His grandmother texted him something like, "Good, we knew you'd come to your senses." He later remarried a more Christian woman that his family approves of. I hope things are easier for her now. Story 25. I had a college roommate for 2 years who was a really nice guy but a bit quirky. He'd stay up all night watching ESPN, lived for sports, and slept until noon daily. He only took afternoon or night classes and went home to his dad's house every weekend, never staying on campus. After graduating, he worked as a janitor at a nursing home, then got a job at Burger King. He was a skinny, short, balding guy, completely devoted to watching sports. When I knew him, he'd never had a girlfriend. I don't think I ever saw him talk to a girl. About 3-4 years after college, I heard he was getting married. I was shocked. I got invited to the wedding, and that was the first time I met his wife. She was absolutely beautiful and seemed really nice. I was stunned. I didn't think they'd last. They got married around 20 years ago. To be honest, I hadn't spoken to him since the wedding and had no clue if they were still together. Out of curiosity, I just looked him up on Facebook. Turns out they're still together and have 2 boys. Story 26. 2 months before his 28th birthday, a friend of mine noted the coincidence. He was born on the 28th, and his upcoming birthday was on a Saturday. Perfect occasion to get married, right? Only problem was, he didn't have a fiancée, nor was he in any serious relationship. This guy was the perpetual child-minded, impulsive type. I liked him. He'd practically raised himself after being orphaned young and essentially homeless as a toddler. Despite his rough start, he'd built a successful career as an entrepreneur and businessman. To some extent, he lived every day like it was his last. He was also a bit of a player with many girls who liked him. Within 3 weeks of his eureka moment, he proposed to one of them. He asked my wife and me to be his maid of honor and best man. We declined. The bride barely knew us, and they barely knew each other, but I digress. And we knew this wasn't going to last. You don't marry someone for a numerology coincidence. I tried to talk some sense into him, but he was stubborn. Their wedding ceremony was chaotic. He had no family, while the bride came from a respectable family, but had a questionable social circle. You can imagine the clash in the reception hall. The marriage lasted less than a year. He cheated on her the day she gave birth to their baby. Last I heard, he still has a restraining order because she nearly killed him. Story 27. A good friend married a girl he dated for years, spending the last 2-3 years in a long-distance relationship. During that time, we'd gotten to know him pretty well. When the wedding weekend arrived, the way the bride and her family talked about him was like they were describing a totally different person. It seems she was so focused on reaching the altar that she hadn't noticed he'd changed in some pretty important ways. For instance, she wrote their vows for both of them. I sat there baffled, because her vows referenced goals I knew he didn't have, and poked fun at hobbies he didn't do. One part even mentioned her letting him go hunting. My husband and I exchanged glances because we'd known him as a vegetarian the entire time we'd known him. Unsurprisingly, they're now divorced. Story 28. We all saw it coming well before my husband's sister married her on-again, off-again boyfriend. She was furious that my husband got married before her, so she gave her boyfriend an ultimatum. Surprisingly, he went along with it and proposed. She then made him spend every penny he'd saved for a house on her dream wedding, which cost over $50,000. At the wedding rehearsal, they kept exchanging angry looks, which was pretty typical for their relationship. They constantly fought, and it was obvious he didn't want to go through with the wedding, but felt it was too late to back out. On the wedding day, he was so intoxicated. Instead of acting tense around her, he smiled and laughed all night. It was clear he needed a lot of liquid courage to get through the day. He ended up cheating on her about a year later, but she stayed with him. I'm sure she holds it against him at every opportunity. I feel bad for him because she's very toxic and manipulative, but at the same time, he got himself into this mess. Story 29. I used to work at a wedding venue and could probably write a book about the experiences I've had, but the first story that comes to mind is this one. At this venue, we had a bridal suite and a groom's suite where the wedding party could get ready, have drinks, hang out, watch movies, or even bring in game consoles to play. For context, we had a huge flat-screen TV in the groom's suite, along with a pool table. Since the groomsmen always got ready fast and had their pictures taken first, it wasn't uncommon for them to kill time with other activities while waiting for the ceremony to start. Anyway, when it was time to line up the bridal party, another coordinator and I went to the groom's suite to make sure he was ready to go, since the ceremony was about to begin. We walked in to find him half-dressed, sitting on the couch, playing a video game, not even bothering to look up. The other coordinator and I said, "Hey, groom, we've already started lining everyone up. It's time to start your ceremony, since it's your wedding." He just sat there, silent, still playing, and finally said, "Yeah, give me a second. I can't pause this right now." Right before his own wedding ceremony. The ceremony ended up starting late because he didn't want to stop playing. If I'm not mistaken, they divorced 4 months later. Story 30. I've been a wedding DJ for about 25 years, and I've often thought about making a book from all the stories I've collected. Here's a quick one. There's a place where I live called the Belgian Club, and it's the cheapest private venue around that serves alcohol. In fact, they probably make up their rental margins from the sheer volume of alcohol sales. So any wedding at the Belgian Club is bound to involve plenty of drinking. In northern Wisconsin, where this is, there's a tradition where the groomsmen steal the bride, or sometimes the bridesmaids steal the groom. From a DJ's perspective, it's a terrible tradition because it brings the entire event to a halt while they disappear for sometimes an hour or more. At one event, the groom was stolen, meaning they took the limo and went to another bar. Before it happened, the bride came to me and asked if I could stop it. Not exactly part of my job, but I tried. It didn't work. When they finally returned, I understood why she'd been so upset. One of the bridesmaids had apparently cheated with the groom in the past, and there was a rumor that something had happened between them during the theft. When they got back, as I was setting up the first dance, the bride confronted the groom in front of all the guests, and I think she even slapped him. The bridesmaid got involved, and before I knew it, they were pulling each other's hair and had to be dragged apart. Believe it or not, they managed to compose themselves enough to proceed with the formal dances, including a bridal party dance. But I stayed on high alert, just in case things got physical again. It was one of the worst weddings I've DJ'd. Terrible behavior, especially given their history. I felt bad for the bride, but I couldn't help wondering why she went through with it, if things were that unstable. Story 31. When I was doing a lot of wedding videography, I had some wild experiences. I'd gotten pretty successful by getting my company on tons of vendor lists, and I'd entered the industry with a solid 10 years of filming and editing experience. I thought being a wedding videographer sounded exciting, but it was honestly about as stressful as working in retail or fast food. It's basically customer service for an event with no redos. You deal with bridezillas, angry moms, and the occasional groomzilla. But you also see a lot that makes you grateful for your own life. Toasts gone wrong, runaway brides, drunken rants, you name it. This story isn't the wildest, but it's the one that really made me lose some respect for the industry. A common package option was an interview where the bride and groom would talk about their big day. Couples paid extra for this, so you'd think they'd put thought into their responses. One of the worst weddings I shot involved a groom who acted like he didn't want to be there. Before recording, I chatted with him briefly to make him comfortable and explained that I'd be removing my voice during editing, so he should answer in full sentences. When I asked how they'd met, he said, "A baseball game," and just stopped. I waited for him to elaborate, but he said, "What's your next question?" I tried to get him to restate and expand, but I got nothing. When I asked, "What's your favorite thing about her?" he replied, "Probably her hair," and nothing more. At that point, I felt like I was wasting my time and asked if he even wanted to continue the interview since I wasn't getting anything usable. He insisted he was fine and just answering the questions. So I went on, "What are you looking forward to most about marriage?" His one complete answer that day was, "Honestly, I live alone now, so it seemed beneficial to have someone else around. I'm looking forward to her cooking and doing my laundry." Haha, just kidding, can you cut that out? I was stunned. Half of me wanted to ask if he even loved her. She was the sweetest person, and he just didn't seem to care. I ended up deleting that whole interview and told her we didn't have time for it. In hindsight, I almost wish I'd left it in because I later heard they divorced about 6 months in. Celebrity weddings, though, are even worse. You're treated like a prop while their famous friends take selfies and get in the way of your shots. Expectations are sky high, and every minute has to be perfect. I left that industry with plenty of gray hairs. It was great for my career in the long run, but I'd never go back unless it was as a second shooter. You end up with some hilarious stories, but it's just not worth it. Story 32. On the morning of my uncle's wedding, the bridesmaid, who was the groom's daughter, was in tears because the wedding was still going ahead. My grandmother didn't like the bride either. In the end, they didn't get married. My uncle caught the bride writing 2 Valentine's Day letters, only one was for him, a few weeks earlier. She insisted the other letter was just to cheer up a lonely friend and kept saying they couldn't cancel because they'd already spent so much money and people would talk. His response was to let the wedding proceed only if they signed a fake certificate on the day, and, if there were no issues, they'd officially marry at a courthouse 6 months later. The day after the wedding, a guest who hadn't attended revealed she'd seen her husband's phone unlocked right before the ceremony and found out he'd been cheating on her with the bride. He confessed immediately. She didn't go to the wedding, partly because she was distraught and partly to avoid causing a scene during the vows. She told him the next day. My uncle dumped the bride on the spot, went on the honeymoon alone, and ended up meeting the woman he's currently with on the cruise. The bride tried to say she'd left him over an argument in which he told her she'd never have kids. My uncle's wealthy friend shared their text messages to set the record straight while my uncle was still on the honeymoon. Watching it all fall apart in real time was some of the best drama I've ever witnessed. Story 33. I wish I had a lighthearted story to add, but this one is pretty tough. I'm a first-generation Filipino-American, and I've witnessed a lot of spousal issues in my mom's friend group. But one memory stands out the most. My mom had a lovely friend named A. She came to the U.S. alone, working at an assisted living center to support her kids back in the Philippines. She was vibrant, a born performer, and I thought she was one of the most amazing women. Her ex-husband in the Philippines was a deadbeat, and her parents had disowned her for working as a nightclub singer in her teens. She sent money to her aunt to care for her kids, and her greatest dream was to bring them to the U.S. She met a guy at work named Stuart. I don't mind using his real name. He's awful. He seemed supportive and talked about wanting to bring their kids to live with them. I got pregnant and they planned to marry. I was a flower girl at the wedding, and the incident happened during the rehearsal dinner. The dinner was at a rented clubhouse instead of a restaurant, and rather than catering, A and her friends, including my mom, cooked Filipino food while Stuart got drunk with his friends and family. The wedding felt very one-sided, with maybe 20% of the guests there for A and 80% for Stuart. I was only about 7 or 8, so I didn't fully understand. While wandering around, I opened the pantry door by mistake and saw Stuart push A, who was pregnant, against the shelves. He grabbed her wrists and was about to grab her neck when he noticed I was there. The kitchen went silent. I'd never seen someone physically assaulted like that before. I don't remember much from that night afterward. The next day, A was crying under her veil before the ceremony. It was the beginning of 4 miserable years. Even as a kid, I couldn't understand how she went through with it. Maybe it was because they worked together, or because she was pregnant with his child. Perhaps she felt she had no other option. There is a sort of happy ending. She later met a kind older man named B who genuinely loved her. He brought her children to live with them on a beautiful ranch. They were happy for 2 years until her youngest child, the one she had with Stuart, was diagnosed with brain cancer and passed away before turning 7. But B was her rock through it all. Stuart didn't even come to his daughter's funeral. Story 34. At my brother's wedding, my date and I were seated at a large 20-person table at the reception with some family hunting buddies, since I was good friends with them. The table beside me was filled with 20 of my closest relatives. Directly in front of us was the bride and groom's table, with 2 family tables on either side for immediate family. The wedding was over 3 hours away, and my hunting buddies were all in their 70s. None of them came. I'm very close with my brother and our relatives, so I was surprised to find myself sitting alone at this huge table with my date. The immediate family table was only occupied by my parents and my rich aunt and uncle, who gave the couple $5,000 as a wedding gift. My brother and I only saw them at reunions, so it felt odd that I was seated away from my parents and close family. I approached my brother and asked if I could sit with my parents and aunt and uncle since none of the hunting friends were there. My brother and I have a great relationship and lived together for 27 years until he moved in with his fiancée. Naturally, he said I could move over, but his wife gave him a sour look, whispered something to him, and then told me no. My feelings were genuinely hurt that my brother didn't stand up to her, but I decided not to make a fuss on their big day and figured I'd discuss it with him later. I told my mom that my brother's new wife was probably going to leave him within a year or 2. She was a type A personality who seemed to expect him to magically change after the wedding to fit her ideals. My brother's an amazing person and frankly too good for her. 10 months later, my brother came to my house for Easter and told me he'd been living alone for 3 months. His wife had left him. He hadn't told the family, hoping they'd get back together, and he didn't want to damage our opinion of her. I knew when she disrespected his family that it wouldn't last. I rarely hold grudges, but she broke my brother's heart. I sincerely hope she regrets her actions, though I doubt she does. Still, I wish her a lot of discomfort for the way she treated him. Story 35. My cousin and I are the same age, and when we were around 25, he married a girl he'd been dating for a while. She had dropped out of high school when she got pregnant with his child, and they put off the wedding until she could fit into the rather revealing dress she wanted to wear. After a few years, they split up because she felt she'd married too young and missed out on the wild period her friends were enjoying in their early 20s. Since the split, she's been in jail a couple of times and struggled with a bit of substance abuse. The wedding itself was massive, with 6 bridesmaids and groomsmen, elaborate flower arrangements, candles, and a fully formal setup. Every warning sign was there, and it seemed like everyone but the immediate families could see it. The only real surprise was that the marriage lasted 3 years. If you do the math, he was 23 when they started dating, and she was only 16. He was the oldest person at her junior and senior proms besides the chaperones, making it his 7th and 8th consecutive proms. He apparently liked them young. Classic Kentucky. The best part of the wedding was my sweet Southern grandmother pulling me and my girlfriend aside and, with a steely look, saying that if I got my girlfriend pregnant before marriage, she'd take care of it. My girlfriend cracked up while I turned bright red. So far, only my niece and her husband and my wife and I are the only couples in our family, out of 7 kids who haven't had children before marriage. Story 36. I was supposed to be a bridesmaid at my best friend's wedding. We were also roommates. A week before the wedding, I walked in on her and her fiancé's close friend, Brett, cuddling in bed under the covers, watching Harry Potter. She tried to play it cool and said, "Hey, come join us and watch this movie with Brett and me." I just said no and shut the door. Later, I asked her if anything was going on between them. She got really upset and told me I was no longer going to be her bridesmaid because she didn't want me thinking that way about her during the wedding. I still went to the wedding and watched from the audience as all our friends stood up there as bridesmaids and groomsmen, including Brett. Everyone kept asking why I wasn't a bridesmaid anymore, but I didn't say anything. I didn't have proof, but I was pretty sure my suspicions were correct. A year later, her husband called Brett to complain that she had cheated on him with someone else. Brett came clean, telling him that they'd hooked up multiple times, including when I caught them watching a movie, which is why I was kicked out of the wedding. Her husband called me to ask if she'd ever cheated with Brett. At that point, I wasn't speaking to her, so I told him what I'd seen. Story 37. Friends of my husband got engaged shortly after us and married a year later. At the time, I was doing wedding photography, and since my husband was in the wedding party, they asked if I'd be their photographer. I agreed and did it as a gift to them. I worked hard all day, but the bride treated me like a personal assistant. I brushed it off because it was her day. She didn't smile once while walking down the aisle. I've done a lot of weddings and never seen a bride not smile. She was bossy, a bit rude, and just sour the whole day. On the way home, I told my husband I didn't think they'd last. He agreed. I finished editing the photos and didn't think much of it. For the next 4 years, they stayed married, but I noticed they never displayed any wedding photos in their home. There was a small table in the basement with a few pictures hidden away where no one would see them. They finally divorced after 4 years. She took everything, and he ended up moving back in with his parents. It turned out she'd been even more controlling behind closed doors and was upset that we were having a baby while they couldn't conceive. She eventually cheated, got pregnant, and left him. Since then, I've predicted a few other marriages wouldn't last, though I haven't always been right. Even my husband and I took a break and separated for a couple of years, just dating each other while co-parenting. We married young and had a lot to learn. Now it's been 14 years. Story 38. I went to a wedding about 12, 13 years ago for a friend who married someone he'd met in school. They even made it through 4 years of long-distance dating. We had the bachelor party 2 nights before the wedding. My friend was quiet and in a bad mood, which was unlike him, as he was usually upbeat. The bachelor party included archery, quad biking, and pub hopping, but he stayed reserved the whole time. We got back to his place in the early hours, and his fiancée's bachelorette party arrived less than an hour later. She immediately went up to him and told him she'd had an amazing night and hooked up with other guys. I overheard and thought for sure the wedding was off. Turns out they had an agreement to treat it as one last single night. He wasn't interested in doing the same, but she took full advantage. All he said was, "I'm glad you had a nice night, but I don't want to know any details." I was stunned. The craziest part? They're still the only couple from that age group I know who are still together. Story 39. This story might be a bit dark. I was working as a vendor at a wedding where the groom was marrying his high school and college sweetheart. They'd known each other most of their lives, and I thought it was sweet, until I actually met them. The groom was, and maybe still is, flamboyantly gay. He and the best man were clearly more than just friends. Meanwhile, the bride was spending time with a guy from their friend group, and it was obvious she was really into him. But we were there to work. Everyone is different, and I try not to judge. I was just doing my job, smiling and keeping my thoughts to myself. During the reception, the newlyweds were all over each other, dancing, kissing, doing the cake thing, toasting, the works. Then, like a light switch, they just stopped. The song ended, and suddenly, people started saying their goodbyes and leaving. The whole place cleared out in minutes, and we were left wondering what had happened. Turns out the groom came from a wealthy family, and the bride's family was well off too. They'd both been told that if they married a suitable man or woman, they'd receive a larger inheritance and a stake in family businesses. In the South, where this was, if the groom had come out as gay, he'd have likely lost his inheritance. The bride's family agreed to the arrangement because they'd known each other since childhood. They had a big circle of friends who were in on the plan, so everyone played along. As soon as the parents left the reception, nobody cared about keeping up appearances. They did the whole show just to get the photos for their grandparents' hallways. Once I learned this from my boss at the end, everything about the day made sense. Story 40. He was a dedicated, conservative, evangelical Christian, looking for a godly woman to give him children and manage his household. You know the type. He went on a mission trip, met a very traditional girl who had recently converted, and married her. Over time, as he started working for a social work agency, he became more open-minded. He began to regret how he'd treated his wife, realizing he'd ignored her own passions and dreams. He apologized for not caring about her interests and tried to change their marriage dynamic, encouraging her to express herself and have her own opinions. But she never did. They eventually divorced because, as he put it, he felt like he was still married to a doormat with no independent thoughts. She wasn't a bad person, and her culture and upbringing likely shaped her behavior. It's just a sad situation all around, though the silver lining is they never had children. Story 41. This story involves my mom and her third husband. She was excited about their wedding and the big party with all their friends, while he was off drinking with his buddies. When it came time to cut the cake, and my grandma was taking a picture, he smashed a plate full of cake in my mom's face. I saw her expression flicker for a split second before she played along, laughing and pretending it was all in good fun. But I could see how hurt and angry she was, just under the surface. He always treated her that way, completely disregarding her feelings and needs while she had to cover it up and act like everything was perfect. They barely lasted 4 years with several breakups in between. In general, I think cake smashing is a sign of immaturity or imbalance in a relationship. Sure, some couples do it for fun and are happily married for years, but in every instance I've seen, the one smashing cake has turned out to be a selfish jerk. Story 43. The wedding was in Florida. We're from Chicago, so our whole group of friends and their wives or girlfriends flew down for it. It wasn't a huge wedding, about 75 people, but everyone had traveled, paid for an expensive hotel, given gifts, and for the groomsmen, bought clothes and shoes because she didn't want rental suits or for us to wear our own chinos, white shirts, and boat shoes. After the rehearsal, everyone who'd flown down wanted to go out together, especially since we hadn't really seen him, except for a few of us in the wedding party. We rented a small party bus to take him out bar hopping for a bit. At first the bride refused, then reluctantly joined us, but sat on his lap the entire time, not letting him dance or joke around with us. She even made them call a cab to leave at 9 p.m. Okay, it's the night before the wedding, so maybe get some rest. Somewhat understandable. The rest of us stayed out. The beachside wedding was nice the next day, but before dinner, the couple left to take photos. Dinner was served, ended, and they still hadn't returned. They finally came back as the dancing started, but instead of joining everyone, they sat down to eat, so no one got to dance or hang with them. Eventually, they did the traditional dances. But while he smiled and watched her dance with her father, she paid no attention when he danced with his mother and talked to someone with her back to the dance floor. Around 9:30, the DJ announced that we needed to start wrapping up and asked everyone to stack chairs in the corner, as we needed to be out by 10 p.m. This was in a nice little event space in the hotel, and we were all dumbstruck that it was ending so early with barely any dancing or festivities. Afterward, we all gathered by the pool to keep drinking and hanging out, but the bride and groom were nowhere to be found. They eventually came out, and one of our friends asked, "Hey, we didn't really get to spend any time with you guys this weekend. Are there any breakfast plans tomorrow? Maybe we could all get together," she snapped. "We have a 7:30 a.m. flight for our honeymoon. We're getting out of here." Other details. She had just 1 or 2 friends fly down, one of whom spent time with us and even mentioned that she was surprised to be included in the wedding, since they weren't particularly close. Her parents paid for the wedding on the condition that her sister be her maid of honor, even though they weren't friendly. So the guests were basically all our friends, who had known each other for over 20 years, and their families. We all flew to Florida for the wedding and barely saw the couple. Not good. They moved to Texas soon after and divorced about a year later. Rumor had it she started cheating almost immediately, though he never talked about it. It was sad, really. Everyone could see it wasn't going to work and watched it unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. It even affected our friendships for years. That winter I got married, and he didn't come, saying he couldn't get off work, only telling me after I called to confirm since I hadn't gotten their RSVP. Woo, it actually felt pretty good to type all that out. Story 44. There wasn't a specific moment, but I just knew in my gut that the woman my best friend was about to marry wasn't the one for him. The night before his wedding, the groomsmen and I were toasting in the hotel courtyard, giving him our best wishes. I was the last to go, and I straight up told him that I didn't think she was right for him and didn't see it working out, but that I'd support him if he was happy. He laughed about it, but nobody else did, and we all went to our rooms. They got married. About 2 years later, my friend was getting a tattoo of a sonogram that he thought was his child. Fast forward about a year. His wife has the baby, and it turned out to be part Asian. That wouldn't have been an issue, except that both he and his wife are white. Turns out, back when he got the tattoo, the artist who did it was the guy she cheated with. Luckily for my friend, his wife was a family attorney, so the divorce was quick and smooth. I still think about that scenario sometimes and just shake my head thinking, WTF, man. Story 45. My father-in-law's wedding was quite the experience. He was marrying the woman who nearly destroyed my husband's family years ago. About 12 years back, my father-in-law got involved with a much younger girl. He got caught, had to resign from his job, and put his family in a financial and emotional mess. Despite all that, he and my mother-in-law stayed together. Fast forward about 8 years, and he decided to leave my mother-in-law for the same woman who had almost wrecked his family. The divorce was messy, with my husband mediating while managing a move to Texas and buying a house. It really strained his relationship with his father. We were invited to the wedding, and my husband went in hopes of mending things with his dad. I went along for emotional support. Bad idea. The wedding was held at a country club. I'm black and my husband is white, so I couldn't help but feel like it might have been a setup. There wasn't a drop of melanin in the room. We got plenty of hard stares. The ceremony was long and awkward for us, with my husband cringing the entire time. But at least the food was good, and the drinks were strong and free. Story 46. This story is from my cousin's wedding. Her parents passed away when she was young, and her groom's parents never liked her, telling her she needed to plan the perfect wedding for their son because it was his big day. The groom was incredibly self-centered, insisting that everything be about him and barely acknowledging his new wife. He spent the evening drinking with his friends and gave her just a quick dance. He even got angry when she did the father-daughter dance with her brother, saying she didn't need to dance with another man. After the ceremony, the groom planned to give a motivational speech to his single friends on how to get a wife. He was a motivational speaker and brought his equipment to the venue. While setting up his mic in a small back room, the system accidentally turned on, broadcasting his conversation with his friends. He was overheard saying, "It's fine to cheat as long as she doesn't find out," and laughing about how his bride's weekend night shifts left him free to see his ex-girlfriend. The bride was devastated, and her best man, yes, the bride's best friend since childhood was her best man, found the groom and delivered some justice, letting the groom and his friends know exactly what he thought of them. The groom's parents were mortified. His mother was the only one who went to the bride, knelt down, and apologized on behalf of her son before they left with him. The bride went home with her best man that night. They divorced the next day. Funny enough, she and her best man still live together as roommates, just as friends. Lifelong friendship goals, honestly. Story 47. This story involves a friend who married someone I'd describe as a little immature. He wasn't a bad guy, but definitely not on her level. He collected spiders as a hobby, quit jobs constantly, and just wanted to play video games. Meanwhile, my friend was educated, smart, and just awesome. The wedding day arrived, and as I watched, I thought, oh wow, she's really going through with it. As they stood at the altar, her clearly tipsy uncle decided to march up the aisle himself. The bride and groom didn't notice, but everyone else did, and it was hard to watch. The uncle started shouting, "That's my niece. You hear me? That's my niece up here," while doing a little dance. The bride's side of the chapel was frozen in shock. Instead of helping, the groom joined in, repeating after him and making a scene while the preacher just stood there. My friend, the bride, was clearly distressed, repeatedly saying, "John, please stop. Uncle Bob, please go sit down." Her mom finally stepped in and led her uncle away, but the groom whined, "Why'd you have to do that? That was fun," completely oblivious to how humiliated she was. The preacher somehow brought the ceremony back on track, but afterward, the bride's face was bright red with embarrassment. They stayed married for 2 years and thankfully didn't have kids.